It's time to sum up the failings of McClellan's concluding video on Leviticus and Lesbianism entitled, quote, "My final response to Robert Gagnon, once more into the breach," which is his response to my video, "Is Dan McClellan right that ancient Israel accepted lesbianism?" After looking at the grade that he gives me, I will summarize my assessment of his own performance. This is part 5 of my video rejoinder to McClellan's final response. Hi, my name is Robert Gagnon. I am a visiting scholar of the Bible at Wesley Biblical Seminary in Ridgeland, Mississippi. I've published extensively on the Bible and homosexuality in scholarly works, including a 500-page book on the subject. Near the very end of his response to my video, at the 21-minute mark, McClellan responds to my concluding assessment of his argument on Leviticus and lesbianism. This once again demonstrates McClellan's preference for LGBTQ dogma over biblical data. Looks like Dogma Dan once again showed up instead of Data Dan.
Looks like a D+ student at best showed up to my class and pretended to be the professor.
This patently puerile put-down is risible, given his extraordinarily convoluted and contradictory argument about Leviticus and lesbianism, offered by someone who has no expertise in the area of the Bible and homosexual practice. His one publication on the subject, a 24-page chapter in his own book, was written at a mere master's level knowledge of the material, including awareness of the secondary literature and the most important counterarguments to his position, as well as quality of argumentation. Let us now sum up the results of our prior 4-part rejoinder of McClellan's convoluted attack of my initial recording debunking his claim that the Levitical prohibitions of male same-sex intercourse did not carry any implicit indictment of female same-sex intercourse. I will allow you, dear listener, to decide what grade McClellan should receive for his performance. Note the intentional word choice. Ask yourself whether his blatantly self-contradictory position on Leviticus and lesbianism is due to being logic challenged or to a deliberate effort at gaslighting and prevarication. Here are 10 points regarding the failings of McClellan's final response on Leviticus and lesbianism. First, in his response, McClellan charges me repeatedly with strawmanning his view and wildly misrepresenting him in my video. He now says that he all along believed that the authors of Leviticus 18 and 20
probably would have rejected
female same-sex intercourse. He makes the charge
he does not engage in good faith,
despite the fact that A, McClellan gives not the slightest hint that he conceded this, either in 95 minutes of prior video response to me or in his skimpy published material on the Bible and homosexuality. And B, his newly divulged concession blatantly contradicts his repeated claims about Leviticus and lesbianism, not only in his prior 2 responses to me, but even in his final response, where he makes the concession. The fault, dear Dan, is not with me, much less in the stars. Second, this newly divulged concession on McClellan's part,
they probably would have rejected it as well,
raises the obvious question as to why it took him so long to divulge to me and to his listeners that he thought that the authors of Leviticus 18 and 20
likely would have had a problem with female same-sex intercourse.
The equally obvious answer for why McClellan did not disclose this concession in 95 minutes of prior video response to me is that this concession would show him to be doing what he falsely charged me with doing, namely,
he's arguing directly against himself.
Third, McClellan still claims, even as he insists that I
straw man and wildly misrepresent my position,
that there is
reasonable doubt
about the assertion that as regards female same-sex intercourse, the authors of Leviticus 18 and 20
probably would have rejected it.
Thus, even by his gaslighting standards, how could I be wildly misrepresenting and strawmanning him when he still thinks that they may not have rejected it? Fourth, McClellan's concession raises another obvious question. Why does McClellan refrain from giving a reason for his concession? I offered 4 reasons for why we can confidently say that the authors of Leviticus 18 and 20 would have rejected female same-sex intercourse, albeit possibly as a non-capital but still serious offense. 1. The moral logic of Leviticus 18:22 and 20:13. 2. The context of ancient Israel, including Deuteronomy 22:5 on cross-dressing, and, added to it, Genesis 1:26-28 on God's intentional creation of male and female as the only sexual counterparts. 3. The history of culture example from Greco-Roman rejection of lesbianism. And 4. The subsequent history of interpretation of the Levitical prohibitions of man-male intercourse in both early Judaism and early Christianity. McClellan rejected all of these arguments, though without any substantive basis for doing so. I have since added a fifth argument, the ancient Near East context, that by contrast with the authors of the Levitical Holiness Code, found ways of accommodating male same-sex intercourse because status, not sex, was the primary consideration for them. If it is not any of these reasons, then on what grounds does McClellan now concede that the authors of Leviticus 18 and 20
probably would have rejected
female same-sex intercourse? McClellan offers no other reason. Indeed, there aren't any other reasons. It would be absurd for McClellan to have no reason for making such a concession. In rejecting all the available reasons for making such a concession and offering no other, McClellan shows that he knows that his concession contradicts his own conclusions about Leviticus and lesbianism. He just can't admit it to his fan base that he is now
arguing directly against himself.
Fifth, importantly, McClellan contradicts his own concession in the very video in which he makes the concession. You would think that McClellan's new concession, namely that the authors of Leviticus 18 and 20
likely would have had a problem with female same-sex intercourse,
amounts to an admission that the Levitical prohibitions of male same-sex intercourse imply a rejection of female same-sex intercourse. Yet he doesn't. Instead, he rejects this out of hand in his final video, saying
the notion that female same-sex intercourse is implicit in Leviticus 18 and 20 is not true,
and that therefore
you cannot interpret Leviticus 18 and 20 to be universally condemning any and all homosexual practice.
This fits with the claims that he makes in his two prior videos. See my 6th and 7th points. Here McClellan insists that there is nothing in the Levitical prohibitions of male same-sex intercourse that should lead anyone to infer a rejection of female same-sex intercourse. This is a completely nonsensical assertion that under the normal protocols of the English language contradicts his new concession that the authors of Leviticus 18 and 20
likely would have had a problem with female same-sex intercourse.
Sixth, and most importantly, McClellan tries to cover up this contradiction by claiming in his final response that when he says that Leviticus 18 and 20
doesn't condemn female same-sex intercourse,
or are not
universally condemning any and all homosexual practice,
all he is doing is making
an observation of an empirical fact,
namely that Leviticus 18 and 20 lack an explicit prohibition of female same-sex intercourse. He adds,
you cannot interpret Leviticus 18 and Leviticus 20 to be universally condemning any and all homosexual practice because it rather conspicuously omits female same-sex intercourse.
This is a tautology, a needless redundancy if there ever was one, if all McClellan meant by Leviticus 18 and 20 not, quote, universally condemning any and all homosexual practice, unquote, was that it lacked an explicit prohibition of female same-sex intercourse. Effectively, McClellan would have been uttering the following gibberish, quote, Leviticus 18 and 20 can't be giving an explicit prohibition of female same-sex intercourse because they rather conspicuously do not give an explicit prohibition of female same-sex intercourse, unquote. It also contradicts his claim that these prohibitions do not even imply a prohibition of female same-sex intercourse. This rhetorical subterfuge on McClellan's part won't work because what he calls an empirical fact, he elsewhere characterizes as his contention and interpretation of the data. No one calls an empirical fact, that is, something that can be seen with one's own eyes, like the absence of an explicit prohibition of female same-sex intercourse in Leviticus 18 and 20, something that absolutely no one can contest. No one calls that a contention, an interpretation of the data. Here is McClellan's contention remark.
My contention is that these prohibitions are only relevant to male Jewish people. This prohibition in Leviticus 18 and 20 has absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with female same-sex intercourse, so it is very clearly not a universal prohibition on any and all homosexual practice. Leviticus 18 and 20 only apply to male same-sex intercourse, and so, irrespective of how widely we extend the scope of that prohibition in regards to the identification of Israel, it still does not apply to female same-sex intercourse.
All that is a contention, not an empirical fact, that Leviticus 18:22 and 2013
are only relevant to male Jewish people and has absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with female same-sex intercourse.
Are, by his own admission, contentions. Mere contentions, too, are his statements that the prohibition of male same-sex intercourse in Leviticus 18 and 20
is very clearly not a universal prohibition on any and all homosexual practice,
and that we cannot
extend the scope of that prohibition to not apply to female same-sex intercourse.
Here is McClellan's interpretation remark that he utters in the very same video in which he claims that he was only stating an empirical fact.
So you cannot point to Leviticus 18 and Leviticus 20 as a universal condemnation of all homosexual practice. That is, by far and away, the most likely interpretation of the data.
McClellan clearly says that the statement that Leviticus 18 and 20 do not provide
a universal condemnation of all homosexual practice
is an
interpretation of the data.
So he calls the assertion that Leviticus 18:22 and 2013 cannot be construed as
a universal condemnation of all homosexual practice.
Has absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with female same-sex intercourse.
At one moment, his
contention.
At another moment, his
interpretation of the data.
But at a third moment, as
an empirical fact.
The first two assertions blatantly contradict his third. The same assertions cannot be both contestable contentions and interpretations of the data on the one hand, and incontestable empirical facts obvious to all who can read on the other hand. That's a contradiction, and it's a contradiction that also contradicts his newly divulged concession that the authors of Leviticus 18 and 20
likely would have had a problem with female same-sex intercourse.
We showed that McClellan's argument that Leviticus 18 and 20
doesn't condemn female same-sex intercourse
deceptively trades on two possible senses. One, an empirical fact that Leviticus 18 and 20 lack an explicit prohibition of female same-sex intercourse that no one contests, and the other, a contention or interpretation that the absence of such an explicit prohibition shows that ancient Israel would not have rejected it at all, which is contestable. McClellan trades on this intentional ambiguity to speak out of two sides of his mouth. Either McClellan is intentionally deceiving and gaslighting, effectively lying, or he is incredibly logic challenged when it comes to the issue of the Bible and homosexuality. Seventh, that McClellan all along was asserting in his first, second, and even final response that the authors of Leviticus 18 and 20 were not rejecting female same-sex intercourse in any way, and that women, even Israelite women, were free to engage in same-sex intercourse, is confirmed by his appeal to Leviticus scholar Jacob Milgram for his contention. According to McClellan,
Jacob Milgram agrees with me that these passages in Leviticus 18 and 20 are limited only to male same-sex intercourse, and this raises one of my big concerns with Gagnon's attempt to assert the universality of this morality.
There is no need to cite an authority for validation of an incontestable,
an empirical fact
that Leviticus 18 and 20 lack an explicit prohibition of female same-sex intercourse. McClellan cites Milgram for validation of a contestable, debatable
contention,
namely that the authors of Leviticus 18 and 20 set up no strictures that would prevent females, even female Jews, from engaging in lesbian intercourse. That's what Milgram believed. And when Milgram stated that, quote, it is incorrect to apply this prohibition of male same-sex intercourse on a universal scale, he meant that all females, including female Jews, were free to engage in lesbian intercourse. And McClellan affirmed this to be a point of agreement that Milgram had with him. And moreover, McClellan was claiming that there was no
universality of this morality,
rejecting
any and all homosexual practice,
because
absolutely nothing whatsoever
about Leviticus 18:22 and 20:13 suggested, inferred, or implied that lesbian intercourse was not permitted. McClellan here was not talking merely about explicit legislation, but rather about morality. There's no other way to understand this claim than to understand it as asserting that the authors of Leviticus 18 and 20 had no moral qualms about female same-sex intercourse. That's what Milgram thought, and that's what McClellan asserted was a point of agreement with him. It is further confirmed by the fact that McClellan clearly pairs his contention about non-application to female same-sex intercourse with a parallel second contention, namely that the Levitical prohibitions of male same-sex intercourse, like the prohibitions of incest, bestiality, adultery, and child sacrifice, have no moral relevance for Gentiles outside the Holy Land. Thus, McClellan was arguing that there is nothing in Leviticus 18 and 20 that has any moral relevance, not just legal relevance, for females anywhere. But this very claim clearly contradicts his newly divulged concession that the authors of Leviticus 18 and 20
probably would have rejected
female same-sex intercourse. That McClellan can't see or can't admit this blatant contradiction, but rather covers it up by claiming that I
wildly misrepresent my position
and
straw man.
His argument is truly disturbing. Eighth, importantly, to show the absurdity of McClellan's self-contradictory argument, one need only compare it to the case of Leviticus and incest. Leviticus 18 and 20 lack an explicit prohibition of sex with one's daughter or full sister. That absence from Levitical incest law is an empirical fact, but what to make of it is a contention or interpretation of the data. Leviticus 18 and 20 do explicitly prohibit sex with one's daughter-in-law and granddaughter, and sex with one's half-sister, stepsister, and sister-in-law. Were someone to say about intercourse with one's daughter or full sister what McClellan says about intercourse between females, one would conclude that the authors of Leviticus 18 and 20 permit incest with one's daughter or full sister. For example, let's say that McClellan said, quote, the notion that a rejection of intercourse with one's daughter or full sister is implicit in the prohibitions of intercourse with one's daughter-in-law and granddaughter, and with one's half-sister, stepsister, or sister-in-law in Leviticus 18 and 20 is not true, unquote. Any reasonable person would conclude from such a claim that the speaker believes that the authors of Leviticus 18 and 20 permitted, accepted, and had no problem with intercourse with one's daughter and full sister. Any reasonable person would conclude the same if McClellan said, quote, we cannot extend the scope of the prohibitions of intercourse with one's daughter-in-law and granddaughter and with one's half-sister, stepsister, or sister-in-law to apply to intercourse with one's daughter and full sister, unquote. Or, quote, the prohibition of intercourse with one's daughter-in-law and granddaughter and with one's half-sister, stepsister, or sister-in-law has absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with intercourse with one's daughter or full sister, unquote. Or, quote, the prohibition of intercourse with one's daughter-in-law and granddaughter and with one's half-sister, stepsister, or sister-in-law is clearly not a universal prohibition of any and all intercourse with a daughter or full sister, unquote. All such assertions would be taken by any reasonable person familiar with the normal meaning of words as meaning that the authors of Leviticus 18 and 20 had no moral qualms with men who had intercourse with their daughters and full sisters. Such assertions would also be understood to be in direct contradiction with a newly revealed concession by the speaker that the authors of Leviticus 18 and 20
probably would have rejected
intercourse with one's daughter or full sister. If the speaker then remonstrated that he had been wildly misrepresented and his views strawmanned, everyone would know that the speaker was either employing rhetorical deception or being incredibly logic challenged. Ninth, I showed that McClellan was a one-trick pony using what is effectively a misogyny or woman-hating argument. Namely, it's all about male dominance over females for a so-called probable rejection of male same-sex intercourse, that it's just all about keeping men on top and women on the bottom, literally and figuratively. I showed how this was at odds with, first, the ancient Near Eastern context, where the absolute prohibition of male same-sex intercourse in the Levitical Holiness Code contrasts with Middle Assyrian and Hittite laws, where accommodations are made for a penetrated male partner who is of lower status, not part of the same community, or consenting. Second, the context of ancient Israel, specifically Genesis 1:26-28, and, on cross-dressing, Deuteronomy 22:5, both of which clearly make sex differentiation, not status differentiation, primary considerations for establishing a male-female prerequisite for sexual relations. Third, the history of culture analogy from the Greco-Roman world on lesbianism. And fourth, the history of interpretation of the Levitical prohibitions in both early Judaism and early Christianity. The main concern for the authors of Leviticus 18:22 and 20:13 was the discomplementarity of same-sexness, not a concern to maintain male dominance over females. I also noted that women in lesbian relationships could, in a diminished sense, quote, play the role of a man, unquote, despite lacking a natural male organ for penetrating, and indicated that any woman who viewed the femaleness of her sexual partner as a sexual counterpart or complement to her own sexual identity was effectively treating her or her partner, at least partly, as a man. 10th, I showed that McClellan's facile dismissal of evidence both from a univocal history of religions or cultures and from a univocal history of interpretation of Leviticus 18:22 and 20:13, both of which led to a conclusive indictment of lesbianism without any dissenting viewpoint, was based on McClellan's own LGBTQ dogmatic needs, rather than on how a historian would handle this data. We noted that McClellan could point to no ancient society that in rejecting categorically male same-sex intercourse did not also reject female same-sex intercourse. Given all the scholarly and intellectual failings in McClellan's rejoinder to me, his logical missteps and contradictions, on top of his blatant gaslighting and arrogance, he is the last person who should be giving out a bad grade to anyone, least of all to someone who has far more expertise in this field than he does. He is not even considered a player in the scholarly discussion of the Bible and homosexuality by any biblical scholar who has made a significant contribution in print. I leave it to you, fair listener, to give him his grade.